There is a second hayfield that has been the subject of similar long-range careful observation in the families of a different watershed, in a different hollow, on the north side of the Upper Elk, where a family named Yoakum has, by the careful long-range account of the older people of that watershed, been keeping an old hayfield in a similar restricted mowing pattern for 4 generations. The hayfield in question is a slightly smaller field than the reedy hayfield on the Upper Cumberlands, and it is, by the careful long-range observation of the Yoakum family, of a similar kind. The perimeter rule is the same. The time of day rule is the same. The chain of family transmission of the rule is the same. The Yoakum hayfield is, by the careful long-range account of the family, on a piece of ground that was, in the 1800s, on the lower edge of a Cherokee campsite. The Cherokee campsite in question has been carefully documented by the local historical society, and the documentation is on the public record. The Cherokee campsite was, by the documentation, in use from at least the early 1700s until the removal of the Cherokee from that part of the Elk in the 1830s. The Yoakum family has, by the family's long-range oral record, kept the hayfield under the same restriction for as long as the Yoakum family has been on the hayfield, which is, by the long, careful record, since the 1860s. The restriction has, by the long, careful record, been communicated in every generation, by the older members of the Yoakum family to the younger members, in the careful, long, slow, unadorned language of mountain parents who are explaining a thing to children who have not yet understood the thing, but who are going to understand it in due course, by the long, patient attention of the family. The restriction, by the long, careful record, is the same restriction that has been communicated in the families of the reedy hayfield on the Cumberlands, and it has, by the long, careful record, been in force for as long as either family can remember. The voices in the Yoakum hayfield are, by the careful long-range account of the Yoakum family, slightly different from the voices in the reedy hayfield. The voices in the Yoakum hayfield are, by the careful long-range account of the family, lower in pitch than the voices in the reedy hayfield. The voices in the Yoakum hayfield are, by the family's careful long-range account, more song-like, in the patient long slow way that older Appalachian song-like things are song-like. The voices in the Yoakum hayfield are, by the family's careful long-range account, more patient, in the patient long slow way that older Appalachian voices are patient. The voices in the Yoakum hayfield do not, by the family's careful account, carry any words that the Yoakum family has been able to translate. The Yoakum family has, in the long-range, careful record, been keeping its own mowing pattern and its own observation of the perimeter. The Yoakum family has, in the long-range, careful record, been approaching the perimeter fence line in the same careful, restrained way that the reedy family has been approaching the perimeter fence line of its field. And the Yoakum family has, by the long-range, careful record, been observing the same phenomenon that the reedy family has been observing in its field, with the same long-range, careful attention, and with the same long-range, careful restraint in communicating the observation to anyone outside the immediate kinship. The Yoakum family has, on at least 3 occasions that the careful long-range record preserves, had a member of the family hear the voices in the hayfield. The Yoakum family has, in each of those instances, recorded the time of day, the weather, the season, the kind of day, the phase of the moon, the location of the hearer along the perimeter, and the subjective description of what the hearer perceived. The records of the Yoakum family have not, by the family's deliberate choice, been made available to anyone outside the immediate family, and the family has, by that same deliberate choice, declined to discuss the records with outsiders. What the Yoakum family has said, in the occasional conversation with outsiders, is that the hayfield is, in the family's long-range observation, a place that has, by long custom, been doing what the reedy hayfield has been doing on the Cumberlands, and that the doing of it has, by long custom, been patient, and that the doing of it has, by long custom, been gentle, and that the doing of it has, by long custom, been the long, slow, patient work of the place itself. The family has said, in those occasional conversations, that the work of the place has not, in the family's careful observation, ever caused any of the family to be frightened. The work of the place, the family has said, has been the long, patient, slow, long, slow. And this, again, is doing considerable work in the family's description, work of the place itself, and the family, in the long, patient practice of being on the place, has been keeping the place in the long-range, careful way that families in those hills have been keeping their places for as long as families have been in those hills. Underscore. Extra. 15. Underscore. There is another granny woman story, told in a slightly different form, on a different creek, in McDowell County, West Virginia. The creek in question is the head of the North Fork of the Elkhorn, near a place called Maybury. The granny woman in this story was a woman named Dovie Mullins, who lived in the 1800s and who was, by the long, careful oral record of the families of the Upper Elkhorn, the most powerful granny woman in the entire watershed for at least 2 generations. Dovie was, by the careful, long-range record of the families who remember her, a thin, sharp woman with a long, calm face and a habit of speaking very softly. Dovie was, by the long, careful record of the families, a woman of considerable spiritual authority. Dovie was, by the long, careful record of the families, a granny who was not, in the ordinary careful practice of the granny women of those counties, given to dramatic claims. Dovie was, by the long, careful record of the families, a granny who was known for 2 things. The first thing Dovie was known for was the herb work. The second thing Dovie was known for was the intercession with the long, patient things of the Upper Elkhorn. There is a story, told with great care in the families of the Upper Elkhorn, about a particular night in the spring of 1897, when Dovie was called to a berth at a cabin on the Upper Elkhorn that had been going badly for more than a day. The laboring woman in this case was a young woman of 20, the daughter of a family who had, by long custom, lived on the Upper Elkhorn. The labor had begun, by the family careful record, on a Monday evening in early May. The labor had not, by Wednesday morning, resolved. The family had called Dovie, by the ordinary careful practice of those families, on the Tuesday evening, when the labor had begun to take on the long, slow, patient shape that older mountain midwives recognize as the shape of a labor that is not going to resolve. Dovie had come. Dovie had, in the patient, long, slow, careful way of the old granny women, gone about the ordinary work of the difficult labor. Dovie had, by her own careful later account, walked out to the spring at the head of the Elkhorn, at the back of the cabin, very late on Tuesday night, with the candle still lit inside. Dovie had, by her own careful later account, brought back a measure of water in a small jar. Dovie had, by her own careful later account, given the water at the moment of crisis on Wednesday morning. And what happened, by the long careful record of the family, was the same thing that happens, by the long careful record of the Sugar Creek granny women, in their own long-range careful practice. The laboring woman, by the family's careful record, felt, at the moment the water was given, that she was no longer alone at the bedside. The laboring woman, by her own careful later account, was joined, at the moment the water was given, by a presence that was not Dovie and was not any of the other women in the cabin. The presence stood, by the laboring woman's careful later account, at the foot of the bed in the long, slow, patient way that the presence at the foot of the bed stands by the long-range careful record of the granny women of those hills. The presence did not speak. The presence did not, by any careful observation of any of the women in the cabin, do anything that could be photographed or recorded. The presence did, by the careful long-range observation of the laboring woman and of Dovey and of the other women in the cabin, take hold of the labor. The labor, by the careful long-range record of the family, resolved within the hour. The child was born alive. The labor, in the careful long-range observation of the family, had been attended in the same long, slow, patient way that the labors of the Sugar Creek granny women are attended. What the laboring woman said, in her own long-range careful account, was that the presence at the foot of the bed had, by her careful observation, been waiting. She said, in the careful, quiet, easy voice that the older women of the Upper Elkhorn use for these things, that the presence had, by her careful observation, not come when the labor began, had not come during the long, slow, difficult Tuesday night, and had not, by her careful observation, been in the cabin during the long, slow, difficult Wednesday morning. The presence, by the laboring woman's careful long-range observation, had arrived at the moment the water was given, and the presence, by the laboring woman's careful long-range observation, had been there, in the cabin, at the end of the bed, waiting for the water to be given, since sometime on the Tuesday before. This is, in the mountain oral tradition of those counties, the careful, long, slow pattern that has emerged over many generations of patience and many careful long-range observations by the granny women of the upper watersheds of those hills, as the patient long, slow pattern by which the long, patient things of those watersheds have been attending to the difficult labors of the families. The pattern is consistent. The pattern is, in the long-range, careful, patient observation of the granny women of those hills, what the long, patient, and, again, the word long is doing serious long-range work here, things of those watersheds do. And the doing of it is, in the long-range, careful, patient observation of the granny women of those hills, what those long, patient things have been doing in those hollers. For as long as the families of those hollers have been attending to the long, patient attendance of those long, patient things. Underscore. Extra underscore 16 underscore. There was, in the years after the death of the son of Claiborne Hall, a third phase of the life of the cabin at the end of Sawmill Hollow. And the third phase is, in the careful long-range record of the family, the most mysterious of the three. The third phase began when the grandson, who was then in his 40s, took the cabin in the ordinary long, slow way that cabins in those hollers are taken after the death of his father. The grandson moved in with his wife, a woman named Lorna, and his 2 children, girls of 9 and 12. He did not, in the ordinary, careful, long-range way of the men of those hollers, live in the cabin in any kind of full-time occupation. He lived in the cabin intermittently, on weekends, in the summer, in the long, slow, careful way that grandchildren of mountain families who have moved to the city return to the cabin, to tend to the small, ordinary business of the cabin, to mow the yard, to keep the porch intact, to watch the place when the older generations have died. What Lorna noticed, on the first weekend after the family moved in, was the same thing that the son had noticed in the years before the son's death. The cabin, in the long, slow evening hours, was making the small, private sounds of a kitchen, late at night, when no one was in the kitchen. The cabin, in the long, slow evening hours, was making the sounds of footsteps on the porch, when no one was on the porch. The cabin, in the long, slow evening hours, was making the sounds of someone walking, with the patient, attentive weight of a person, to the edge of the floorboard near the door of the smaller bedroom, and stopping, and standing, and being, very quietly, patient. Lorna was, by her own careful account, raised in a city. She was, by her own careful account, not given to the older practices of the haulers of the upper pound. She was, by her own careful later account, frightened at first, in the way that city people are frightened by the long, slow, patient, old sounds of a mountain cabin late at night. She went to her husband. She spoke to him about the sounds. He was, she said, by her own careful later account, unsurprised. He was, by her own careful account, entirely comfortable with the sounds. He was, by his own careful later account, accustomed to the sounds. He told her, in the careful, unadorned language of an older mountain man speaking to a city wife, about the long, slow, patient sounds of an old family cabin, that the cabin had been doing this since the time of his grandfather. He told her that the doing of this was, in his long-range experience, something that the cabin did. He told her, in the same careful, unadorned language, that he and the cabin had, by long practice, made the arrangement by which the long, slow, patient sounds could be what the long, slow, patient sounds were, and the family could be what the family was, in the patient, long, slow way that the long, patient things of the Central Appalachians have long, slow, patient arrangements with the families that have lived among them. Lorna, by her own careful later account, sat with the sounds for that first weekend, and then for the next several weekends, and then for the next several summers. She sat with the sounds in the long, slow, unadorned way of a woman who has, by long practice in a city, become accustomed to the long, slow, patient sounds of an old family cabin late at night. She sat with the sounds in the careful, long, slow, unadorned way of the older women of those hollers who have, by long practice, learned to keep the long, slow, patient sounds of those cabins in their long, slow, patient, and unadorned place. What Lorna said on the Sunday evening before they left the cabin at the end of that first summer was this. She said, on the porch, in the careful, easy, unadorned voice that the city wife had, by the long practice of the summer, learned to use for the long, slow, patient things of the cabin that she had felt, by long, careful observation of the weekend and the summer, and the long, slow evenings in the cabin that the cabin had been, in the long, slow, patient way that the cabin had, being shared. She said that the sharing had, by her careful, long-range observation, not been hostile. She said that the sharing had, by her careful, long-range observation, been gentle, in the long, slow, patient way that the long, patient things of those hollers are gentle. She said that the sharing had been, in her careful, long-range observation, the long, slow, patient way of an old family cabin welcoming a city wife who was, by the long, slow, patient, quiet practice of the summer, becoming, in her own long, slow, patient way, an old family wife. She said, in the same careful, long, slow, easy voice, that she would, in the long run, become one of the women of the holler, and that the becoming of it had, by her patient, careful observation, been the long, slow, patient, quiet work of the cabin itself. And that the cabin, in the long, slow, patient way that the cabin had been doing its work. __extra _C17 __. There was a second event on Elk Ridge, by the careful long-range record of the Reedy family, in the spring of 1983, in the same cabin, with the same family members present, and with the same phenomenon. The second event was, by the careful long-range record of the family, more emphatic than the first. The second event was, in the careful long-range observation of the family, brief. The second event was, in the family's careful long-range observation, preceded by the same atmospheric conditions as the first event, a still night, with high pressure, with the kind of late spring, soft, steady, clear weather that the families of the Upper Elk associate with the long, slow, patient activity of the long, patient things of the ridges. The second event occurred on a Friday evening in early May. The family had, by the long-range careful record of the family, gathered for the spring planting. The family had, by the long-range careful record of the family, gone to bed in the ordinary long, slow, patient way of a mountain family of the Upper Elk. The family had, by the long-range careful record of the family, been woken in the deep hours of the night, by a sound that was not the sound of the cabin settling, and that was not by any careful long-range observation of any of the family members who were woken. The sound of any ordinary small event in the long patient ordinary nighttime activity of the cabin. The sound was by the careful long-range record of the eldest daughter of the cousin who was in the small front bedroom on the second night of the event 5 years before, the sound of a child speaking. The child was speaking in a voice that was, by her careful long-range account, unmistakably the voice of a child. The voice was, by her careful long-range account, unmistakably female. The voice was, by her careful long-range account, unmistakably young, not 5 or 6, not 9 or 10, but, she said later, with the careful long-range observational patience that the eldest daughter of the family had developed over the long, slow practice of listening to the long, patient things of the cabin. Perhaps 2, perhaps 3. Speaking in the patient, small voice of a child that young. The child said, by the careful long-range observation of the eldest daughter, what sounded like a word, in a voice that was unmistakably the voice of a child trying, with the patient small effort of a very young child, to say something. The word was not, by her careful long-range observation, a word that any member of her family or any member of the extended family had, in any careful listening, been able to identify. The eldest daughter got up. She walked through the bedroom. She went to the landing at the top of the stairs. The sound, by her careful long-range observation, was coming from the attic. She went up the ladder to the attic. The attic was empty. The sound, by her careful long-range observation, was not coming from the attic. The sound, by her careful long-range observation, was coming, in the patient small voice of a child, from somewhere under the floor of the second story, in the patient small place between the joists and the boards of the original floor. She did not, by her careful long-range account, go down into the place between the joists and the boards. She did not, by her careful long-range account, attempt to find the source of the voice. She went back to her bedroom. She closed the door. She sat in the dark for some time. She did not, in the long-range, careful, patient observation that she had learned from the family, attempt to respond to the small voice in the floor. She did not, by her careful long-range account, attempt to call out. She did not, by her careful long-range account, attempt to investigate. She let the small voice be the small voice. She let the small voice, by the patient, long, slow practice of the family, do its small, long, slow work. In the patient, small, long, slow way, let small voices do their small, long, slow work in the patient, small, long, slow places of old mountain cabins on the long, patient ridges of the central Appalachians. The voice, by the careful long-range observation of the eldest daughter, did not repeat. The voice was, by her careful long-range observation, a single small patient utterance, and the utterance was, by her careful long-range observation, the kind of utterance that patients, in the patient long slow way of mountain patients, make when they have, by long small patient work, finally said what they have, by long small patient work, been waiting to say. The utterance was, by the careful long-range observation of the eldest daughter, the utterance of a small patient who had by long small patient work finally gotten to say something. In the long patient work of the long patient work of being. By long patient work, present in the long patient place. Underscore extra underscore C18 underscore. There was a second event in the cemetery at the Upper Watauga in 2014 in the late spring, with a different phenomenon, with the same careful light, and with the same committee observations. The second event was, by the careful long-range record of the committee, different in shape from the earlier events. The second event was, by the careful long-range record of the committee, The event that the committee has in the careful, quiet, easy, unadorned, long, slow language of the older members of the committee, called the Night of the Lights, and it has, by the careful long-range record of the committee, become the most carefully remembered of the events of the Upper Watauga Cemetery in the long, slow history of the committee that has been keeping the cemetery in the dark. The Night of the Lights occurred on a Wednesday in early May. The committee had, by the careful long-range record of the committee, gone up to the cemetery in the early evening, in the patient, ordinary, long, slow way that the committee has been going up to the cemetery in the evening for as long as the committee has been keeping the cemetery in the dark. The committee had, by the careful long-range record of the committee, begun the mowing in the ordinary, long, slow, patient way. The mowers were running. The floodlights were on. The committee was, in the ordinary, long, slow, patient, unadorned way, working the perimeter of the cemetery, with the small noises of the mowers in the air, with the smell of the cut grass, with the dark of the Upper Watauga beginning to rise in the meadow behind the cemetery. The first light appeared at about 9 o'clock. The light was, by the careful long-range observation of one of the committee members who was working the eastern section of the cemetery on that Wednesday evening, not a normal light. The light was, by his careful long-range observation, of the kind of color that a candle produces when the candle has been burning steadily for an hour in a still room, with no draft. The light was, by his careful long-range observation, approximately the warmth of a candle. The light was, by his careful long-range observation, very small. The light was, by his careful long-range observation, moving in a slow, patient procession along the row of headstones in the eastern section of the cemetery. The light, by his careful long-range observation, was pausing briefly at each headstone. The committee member who was working in the eastern section did not, by his careful long-range account, attempt to approach the light. He did not, by his careful long-range account, attempt to speak to the light. He did not, by his careful long-range account, attempt to interrupt his mowing. He let the mowing be the mowing. He let the light be the light. He finished the strip he was working. He moved to the next strip. He did not, on any of the subsequent strips, look up at the light. The committee member who was working in the western section saw the second light. The second light was, by her careful long-range observation, of the same warm amber color as the first, and of the same small size, and of the same slow, patient procession. The second light, by her careful long-range observation, was moving along the row of headstones in the western section of the cemetery, in the patient, slow, deliberate way of the first light. And the third light appeared in the center of the cemetery, by the careful long-range observation of the committee member who was working the southern section. The third light was, by the careful long-range observation of the committee member, in the patient, small, warm amber color of the first two. The third light was, by her careful long-range observation, not moving. The third light was, by her careful long-range observation, simply present, in the patient, still way that the patient presence of the cemetery, by the long, slow, patient, unadorned observation of the committee, sometimes is. The third light, by her careful long-range observation, was, very simply, present. The committee continued the mowing in the patient, ordinary, slow, unadorned way of the committee. The mowers ran. The lights persisted, in their patient way, for what the committee's careful long-range observation estimated, retrospectively, as approximately 4 to 5 minutes. The committee, by its long, slow, ordinary, careful, patient practice, finished the perimeter of the cemetery. The committee, by the patient, long, slow, ordinary, careful practice, finished the next pass inward. The committee, by the patient, long, slow, ordinary, careful practice, finished the evening's work. The lights, by the patient, long, slow, ordinary, careful observation of the committee, persisted for the duration of the work. The lights, by the patient, long, slow, ordinary, careful observation of the committee, disappeared in the quiet, easy, ordinary, long, slow, careful way when the committee put the mowers away. And the committee walked in the patient, long, slow, ordinary, careful way of the committee down the lane to the parking area. And the committee sat in the patient, ordinary way in the trucks in the parking area. And the committee did not, by the patient, ordinary, long, slow, unadorned practice of the committee, discuss the events of the evening at any great length. The committee, in the patient, ordinary, long, slow, unadorned way, scheduled the next mowing for Friday evening. The committee went home. The cemetery, by the careful, long-range observation of the committee, settled back into its ordinary quiet. The lights, by the careful, long-range observation of the committee, did not return. What the committee said in the days that followed, in the patient, ordinary way, has been preserved in the careful, long-range record of the cemetery committee, with the long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful precision of the committee. The committee said, in the patient, ordinary way, that the cemetery had been doing what the cemetery, by long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful practice, did on quiet nights in late spring. The committee said that the cemetery was, in the patient, ordinary way, attending to itself. The committee said that the attending to itself had, in the patient, ordinary way, taken the form, on that Wednesday in late spring, of 3 small amber lights, and that the 3 small amber lights had, in the patient, ordinary way, done what the 3 small amber lights are understood to do. In the patient, ordinary, long, slow, unadorned, careful practice of the older families of the Upper Watauga. On the patient, ordinary, long, slow, unadorned, careful nights when the older families of the Upper Watauga are keeping. In the patient, ordinary, long, slow, unadorned, careful way that the older families of the Upper Watauga have, by long, slow, patient, ordinary, unadorned, careful custom, been keeping the cemetery in the dark. _extra C19 _. There is one final thing that Theo's daughter, who is still alive, who has been since her father's death in 1991, the keeper of the story, asked me to add to the account of her father's return. The thing she asked me to add is not, in her careful and deliberate judgment, the most dramatic part of the story. The thing she asked me to add is, in her careful and deliberate judgment, the part of the story that has, in the 33 years since her father's death, done the longest, slowest work in her memory. The thing she asked me to add is the part of the story that has, in her own careful, reflective, long-range judgment, become the part of the story she tells most often, and the part of the story that is, in her own careful, long-range judgment, the most likely to be true. The thing she asked me to add is the matter of the dogs. The family had, on the property at the Big Creek, 2 dogs. The 2 dogs were a coonhound and a small terrier. The 2 dogs had, by the long, careful, patient, ordinary observation of the family, been ordinary dogs for the entirety of their lives, up until the Tuesday in February, when Theo had come back from the woods. The 2 dogs had, in the long, careful, patient, ordinary observation of the family, begun, in the weeks after Theo's return, to behave in a way that the family had never before observed in any dog. The dogs, by the careful, long-range observation of Theo's daughter, who was then in her late 20s, and was, by her own careful account, paying very close attention to the dogs, began to follow Theo. They began, very simply, to follow him with the patient, careful, long, slow, ordinary attentiveness of 2 dogs who had, by some long, slow, ordinary process in the weeks after Theo's return, decided that Theo was the thing in the household to which they should attend. They followed him from room to room. They followed him from the front porch to the back porch. They followed him to the woodpile and to the spring and to the barn. They followed him in the long, slow, patient, ordinary way. In the long, slow, patient, ordinary way. in the patient, long, slow, ordinary way of dogs who have decided that the person they are following is, for some reason, the dogs themselves understand and the family does not fully understand, the person to whom they should, by long, slow, patient, ordinary dog attention, attend. The dogs did not. By Theo's daughter's careful long-range observation, bark at him. The dogs did not, by her careful long-range observation, greet him in the ordinary long, slow, patient way that dogs greet people. The dogs did not, by her careful long-range observation, wag the dogs. By her careful long-range observation, attended to him in the long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful, attentive way that dogs attend to something that is not. In some long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful way, strictly a person. The dogs attended to Theo in the patient, long, slow, ordinary, careful way of dogs who have, by long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful observation, detected, in the person they are following, something that the dogs have, by long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful dog practice, been taught to attend to, in the long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful way that old mountain dogs have, by long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful dog practice, been taught to attend to the long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful presence that the dogs themselves, by some long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful dog perception, are able to detect. The dogs followed Theo for the entirety of the 9 years after his return. The dogs followed him with the patient, long, slow, ordinary, careful, attentive focus of 2 dogs that have, by long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful dog practice, made a long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful commitment to a person and to the presence they have detected in the person. The dogs followed him into his bed at night. The dogs followed him into his long, patient evening hours on the porch. The dogs followed him into his long, patient, ordinary, careful death in the spring of 1991. The dogs, by Theo's daughter's careful, long-range observation of the days and weeks and months after Theo's death, did not, in the long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful way, leave the house. The dogs, by her careful, long-range observation, remained in the house. The dogs, by her careful, long-range observation, took up, in the long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful way of 2 dogs that have decided to attend to the long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful presence that had been with the person they had been following, attending to that presence itself, in the long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful way that the old mountain dogs have, by long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful dog practice, been attending to the long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful presences that have been in those hollers, attending to the families that have lived in those hollers. The dogs lived for several years after Theo's death. The dogs lived in the long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful way in the cabin at the Big Creek, attending to the long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful presence that had, in the long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful way that the long, patient things of those hollers do their long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful work, remained after Theo's death in the cabin. The dogs attended to the presence with the long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful, attentive focus of 2 dogs that have, by long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful dog practice, made the long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful commitment of attending, for as long as the dogs are alive, to the long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful presence itself. Theo's daughter has said, in the patient, long, slow, ordinary, careful language of a woman who has been the keeper of a story for 33 years, and who has, by long, patient, ordinary, careful practice, considered every aspect of the story with the patient, long, slow, ordinary, careful attention that the long, patient things of those hollers deserve, that the dogs are the part of the story she is most willing to vouch for. She has said, in the patient, long, slow, ordinary, careful language of an older mountain woman telling me about the patient, long, slow, ordinary, careful thing her father had, by his long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful absence in the woods, brought back with him, that the dogs could tell. She has said, in the patient, long, slow, ordinary, careful language that the keeper of the family story uses for the patient, long, slow, ordinary, careful things of the Big Crick. That the dogs attended to the patient, long, slow, ordinary, careful presence that had come back with her father, and that the dogs attended to it in the patient, long, slow, ordinary, careful way of old mountain dogs for as long as the dogs were alive. She has said in the last minutes of every interview I have done with her over the 33 years that I have been asking her about her father, that she believes, by the long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful observation of the dogs, that the presence that came back with her father is real. She has said, in the patient, long, slow, ordinary, careful language, that she does not know what the presence is. She has said that the presence is not, in her long, patient, ordinary, careful judgment, hostile. She has said that the presence is, in her long, patient, ordinary, careful judgment, what the woods, by long, patient, ordinary, careful custom, do for the families who have, by long, patient, ordinary, careful practice, earned the long, patient, ordinary, careful. And the word long here is doing serious, patient, long, slow, ordinary, careful work. Company of the long, patient, ordinary, careful presence of the long, patient, ordinary, careful, patient presence of the woods. Underscore, extra, C20, underscore. There is another sighting by Coy. It is the second of the sightings that Coy told me about, in the kitchen of the cabin on the Upper Clinch, on the winter afternoon when the dark was coming up off the river. The second sighting occurred 23 years after the first sighting, in 1999, in the autumn, in the same Upper Clinch watershed where the first sighting had occurred, and on a ridge that is, by the careful long-range observation of Coy, in the same general vicinity of the first sighting. Coy was, at the time of the second sighting, 51 years old. He was, by his own careful account, not at that point in his career working in the deep woods in the way he had been working in the first sighting. He was, by his own careful long-range account, working, by then, as a contractor in a small operation that did selective logging and that ran, by Coy's careful long-range account, in the Upper Clinch watershed, in the part of the Upper Clinch watershed where the first sighting had occurred. He was, on the morning of the second sighting, walking a tract that had been logged in the previous winter, looking for a stand of mature poplar that his buyer had asked him to mark. He was, by his own careful account, alone on the tract. His partner that week was a young man named Eldon, who had been with him for 2 summers and who had, that morning, gone down the ridge to deliver a small load of bolts to the buyer's yard at the lower end of the ridge. Coy was alone in the woods in the morning, in the same way he had been alone in the woods in the morning 23 years before. He was, on the morning of the second sighting, wearing a long, dark wool shirt that his wife had, by the careful long-range observation of Coy's wife, packed for him in the ordinary careful way that careful mountain wives pack long-sleeved dark wool shirts for their husbands for cool autumn mornings on the upper ridges. Coy was, at about mid-morning, working his way down a small saddle on the upper west side of the ridge, in a small stand of mature hardwood that had, by the careful long-range observation of Coy, not been logged in the previous winter operation. He was marking trees with a small can of blue paint, in the careful ordinary way of selective loggers. He was, by his own careful account, paying attention to the stand of poplar in the ordinary working way of a working selective logger. He said in the kitchen of the cabin that what he saw was the figure. The figure was, by his careful long-range observation, in the trees on the far side of the stand watching him. The figure was, by his careful, long-range observation, in the same patient, unmoving, attentive posture as the figure had been in 23 years before. The figure was, by his careful, long-range observation, wearing the same long, dark shirt. The figure was, by his careful long-range observation, in the same pale amber color that the figure had been in 23 years before. The figure was, by his careful long-range observation, engaged in the same patient, long, slow, unadorned, ordinary, attentive work that the figure, by Coy's careful long-range observation, had been engaged in 23 years before. The figure was, by Coy's careful long-range observation, watching him with the same patient, long, slow, ordinary, careful, attentive focus that the figure, by Coy's careful long-range observation, had been watching him with 23 years before. Coy did not, on the morning of the second sighting, attempt to wave. Coy did not, on the morning of the second sighting, attempt to speak. Coy did not, on the morning of the second sighting, attempt to approach. Coy did not, on the morning of the second sighting, attempt to do anything that he would not have done 23 years before. And he would not have done, 23 years before, anything that would have made him, in any careful long-range observation of the patient, long, slow, ordinary, attentive manner of the figure, have done anything to break the patient, long, slow, ordinary, attentive observation that the figure, by the long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful observation of the figure itself, had been doing, for as long as the figure had been doing it. Coy watched the figure, on the morning of the second sighting, for what he estimated as about a minute. Coy did not, by his careful long-range account, look away. Coy did not, by his careful long-range account, attempt, in the careful, unadorned, ordinary, long, slow way of a man who has seen this once before, to do anything other than the watching. Coy watched the figure watching him. Coy watched, in the careful, unadorned, ordinary, long, slow way, the patient, long, slow, ordinary, attentive focus of a figure that had, by long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful attentiveness, decided, in some long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful way, to be present in the upper clinch on a cool autumn morning in 1999, in the same patient, long, slow, ordinary, attentive way that the figure had, by the figure's own long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful, attentive practice, decided to be present in the upper clinch 23 years before. And the figure, on the morning of the second sighting, took a single step back, in the same patient, long, slow, ordinary, careful, attentive way. And the figure, by Coy's careful long-range observation, became, by the careful, long, slow, ordinary, patient, attentive process of its own withdrawal, the woods themselves. Coy did not, in the weeks and months and years after the second sighting, attempt to do anything except what Coy has, by his own careful long-range observation, always done. Coy finished the tract. Coy marked the poplar. Coy went home, in the patient, ordinary, long, slow, unadorned, careful way. Coy ate dinner with his wife and his 2 sons. Coy told his wife about the second sighting, in the patient, ordinary, long, slow, unadorned, careful way he has, by long, slow, patient, ordinary, unadorned, careful practice, of telling his wife about the things that have happened to him on the upper clinch. His wife did not, on the evening of the second sighting, react in any way that would indicate, in the long, slow, patient, ordinary, unadorned, careful practice of the household, that the second sighting was unusual. His wife, by Coy's careful long-range account, had been expecting it. His wife, by Coy's careful long-range account, had been waiting for Coy to come home and tell her, in the patient, ordinary, long, slow, unadorned, careful way he has, by long, slow, patient, ordinary, unadorned, careful practice, of telling her about the things that have happened to him on the upper clinch, that he had, on the morning of the second sighting, been watched again. Coy has, by his own careful long-range account, not gone back to that particular ridge in the years since the second sighting. Coy has, by his own careful long-range account, not refused to go back to that particular ridge. Coy has, by his own careful long-range account, simply, by ordinary careful, unadorned, long, slow working scheduling practice, not had occasion, in the 25 years since the second sighting, to go back to that particular ridge. Coy has, by his own careful long-range account, no doubt that the figure is still. By the patient, long, slow, ordinary, careful, attentive, long, slow, ordinary, patient practice of the figure itself, on that particular ridge. Coy has, by his own careful long-range account, no doubt that the figure is, by the long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful, attentive, long, slow, ordinary, patient practice of the figure itself, doing its long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful, attentive, long, slow, ordinary, patient work on that particular ridge. Coy has, by his own careful long-range account, no doubt that the figure will, by the long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful, attentive, long, slow, ordinary, patient practice of the figure itself, go on doing its long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful, attentive, long, slow, ordinary, patient work on that particular ridge, for as long as the ridge has been a ridge, and for as long after the ridge is no longer a ridge as the figure itself. By the long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful, attentive, long, slow, ordinary, patient practice of the figure itself, intends to do its long, slow, patient, ordinary, careful, attentive, long, slow, ordinary, patient work. Exie, the Granny Woman's Ledger. 3 ridges south of Possum Trot, in a holler so narrow that the sun only reaches the bottom on the longest days of summer, there lived a woman the river folks used to call Aunt Sophronia McElwee. She was, by the time I heard her name spoken aloud, already gone. She had been a granny woman. She had kept a granny book, and the people who went up to her cabin on the winter day she died and broke the lock the family lawyer had put on the door found, beside her, a ledger that nobody in that county, before or since, has been willing to read aloud. And Natchin, what I am about to tell you about that ledger, I learned from her great U-2013 niece, Tess, who is still alive, still lives in a trailer at the mouth of the holler, and who will only talk about it when the lights are off and someone else is in the room. Doc S. Mutation Aunt Sophronia was born in 1890 U 2010-8. She was the 7th of 9 children. Her mother died in childbirth with the 8th, and her father married 12 months later, a woman from over on the Cumberland who arrived at the cabin with a leather U 2010 bound book under her arm and a sack of dried roots that smelled, Tess said, of black pepper and turpentine and the iron in creek water. From that woman, Sophronia learned the trade. She learned how to read a pulse by the wrist in 9 seconds. She learned which of the wild U 2010 growing plants on the south slope of the ridge would bring a fever down, and which of them, taken at night, would send a man walking. She learned the words you say in the doorway of a birthing room to keep the wrong spirits out. She learned the words to bring the right ones in when the child is breech and the cord is wrapped. Then, and by the time she was 20 U 2010-3, she had taken over her stepmother's book. By the time she was 30, she had added 300 pages of her own. And from then until she was 90 U 2000 tone, she kept adding. Doc NDCN, most of those pages are what you would expect. Names, dates of births, dates of deaths. A remedy for milk fever. A remedy for the sore that came up on the inside of a child's lip when he slept too close to an open chimney. There is, near the back, a section marked with a single folded corner, headed, in a small, even hand, underscore, cases of the other kind, underscore, ND knit, is that last section Tess will not speak of. She will tell you the section exists. She will tell you there are 18 pages. She will tell you that her great U 2013 aunt was a careful woman, and that the entries are not fanciful. There are dates. There are initials. There are places. Sometimes there is weather.name. What Tess will not do is describe what is written on those pages. And I pressed her. I drove up to the holler twice. The second time with a tape recorder she did not know I was running, and she gave me 3 sentences, and then she made a pot of coffee and only spoke to me about her beagle for the rest of the afternoon. The 3 sentences were these. And first, the cases are real, in the sense her great the U 2013 aunt understood real. They are not nightmares. They are not dreams. They are things that walked into the cabin, or onto the porch, or up out of the root cellar, that the granny woman attended to as she would a fever or a difficult birth. Then in second, in every case, the patient was a child under the age of 9. Then in third, in every case but one, the child recovered. Then the one who did not, Tess said, was a boy named Loyal Mullins, age 6, who lived in a cabin at the head of Huckleberry Branch, and who, on the night of October 14th, 1940 U 2010-7, was carried out of his own bed and laid in front of the fire by something that did not enter through the door. GNWN when Tess said _ did not enter through the door _ She said it the way you say a thing you have been over and over in your own mind until the words have lost their edges. The door was latched. The window was nailed shut with a horseshoe over the nail head. The chimney was too small for anything but a cat to come down. There was snow on the ground, and there were no tracks but the child's. Leading from the bed to the hearth. NN Sophronia was called at 3 in the morning. She walked the 2 miles up the branch in the snow, in her slippers. She was 40 U 2010-9 years old. She carried a leather roll of tools and a small jar of rendered lard into which she had mixed, the week before, ash from a brush pile that had burned on the property for 3 generations. Then what she did in that cabin Tess will not tell me, and what she wrote on page 216 of the ledger she will not read aloud. But she will tell me this. And Sophronia came down the branch before dawn. She was limping. There was blood on the hem of her dress, though she was uncut. The jar of lard was empty. The leather roll was open, and one of the steel tools was missing. And Sophronia, who never in her life, by Tess's recollection, raised her voice in any room, sat down on the porch of her own cabin and wept in the snow until the sun came over the ridge and a neighbor's wife, walking up for chat, found her and led her inside and put a quilt over her shoulders and never, ever asked about it again. 90 Jean Loyal Mullins lived for 9 more days. He did not speak. He did not eat, except for a spoonful of honey a day, drawn from a tin the family kept on a shelf above the stove. He smiled, sometimes, but only when no one was looking. He died with his eyes open. Ng's name on page 216 of the Granny Book. Beneath the entry for October 14th, there is a single line in red ink in Aunt Sophronia's careful hand, NGSen _ do not whistle in that holler. Do not let the children whistle. Do not answer if one of them whistles. _DSHIN NGN people in the holler do not whistle there to this day. Dection. When Tess finally walked me down to her great U 2013 aunt's grave on the south slope of the family cemetery, she stopped at the foot of the headstone and said, very softly, that there are things in the old book that Sophronia only wrote down in the dark. There are names of the dead that do not appear in any church roll. There are descriptions of figures at the tree line of properties where the family has lived for 6 generations. There is, on the last written page of the book, a list of places you are not, by the granny woman's reckoning, ever to spend a night alone. The list has 40 U 2010-2 entries on it. Most of them, I am told, are within a day's drive of where I am sitting now. Snin and I have not read the book. I will not. I do not believe I would survive the reading of it. Nlin, but I have started keeping my own ledger. XI. What the preacher wouldn't forgive. There is a circuit preacher, retired now, who used to hold a week of meetings every August in a brush arbor at the lower end of Tater Holler. and whose sermons, when he reached the part of the revival where the speaking turned to something other than scripture, would cause the metal roof of the arbor to begin, very softly, to ring. And I want to be careful here. I am describing a real man in the terms the mountain people use when they talk about him, in the third person, by a name he asked me when I sat with him on his porch one Sunday afternoon in 2010-19, not to use in print. He is in his mid-2010s. He still preaches when somebody can be persuaded to drive him to the pulpit 2 or 3 times a year. He has a grandson he is raising because his daughter, the grandson's mother, Dalu 2014, but I will not go there. He asked me not to .nenwo what the preacher told me about August, the brush arbor, and the sound the roof made. He told me only after I had agreed, sitting across a card table from him on his porch, with 2 mason jars of blackberry wine between us, that I would not record the conversation. I did not. I am remembering it now. I am remembering it because 2 nights after we sat together, the preacher's sister called me and told me he had asked me onto that porch because he did not expect to see another August. And he was right. He died that October, on a Tuesday, in his sleep, in a way that, by his own description, written on a folded sheet of paper left for his grandson, was exactly the way he had been told, when he was 17 years old, that he would go. Nacton Duddy and I will tell you what he told me. The brush arbor was set back off the road at the bottom of Tater Holler under 3 oaks that were so old the locals called them the Brothers. It had open sides, a wooden floor, and a corrugated tin roof. There were 13 wooden benches. There was a raised platform for the pulpit. There was a slab of wood behind the pulpit on which the preacher's wife would set her Bible and a tin of water, and a small hand-do 2010 crank fan. On the second night of revival, when the speaking was in the part of the service where the preacher walked among the benches and laid his hand on the forehead or the shoulder of the person he had been preaching toward, the roof began, very softly, to ring. Neminit was not the rain. Nemit was not an animal on the tin, and nit was, by every person in the arbor's recollection, the sound that a tin roof makes when a person is standing on the other side of it and speaking, very low, very close to the metal, as if listening through it. Ndn now. I want to be plain. The revival people were not frightened. They were, in the language of the circuit, used to such. They were persuaded that what they heard was one of 3 things. Either it was the Lord speaking, very low, through the holy metal, or it was the lost, somewhere above trying to come down, or it was something else entirely, and they had better not name it, because to name it was to invite it in. Then the preacher told me that he had held this revival for 30 du 2010 8 years, that he had felt, on the second night, every year, the roof began to ring, that he had asked his wife every year whether she heard it, that she had said every year that she did. Then he told me that on the 17th year he had climbed up onto the roof at the end of the service to see. Then he told me that on the 17th year he had found, on the tin directly above the spot where he had been standing when he laid his hand on a young man's forehead, and told him, very quietly, that his sins were not the mountain's problem. The problem was only that he had not forgiven himself. 2014 to see Nen. He told me that he had found, on the tin, above that spot, a print, not a hand. Nen a print, in the rust that comes off tin on a dewy night, of a face. Nen a face that was not, in the preacher's careful description, the face of the young man. A face that was not, in his description of it to me, with the jars of blackberry wine between us, the face of any living person he had ever seen. It was, he said, the size of a man's head. It had eyes that were closed. It had a mouth that was open. The jaw was very long. The brow was very low. The features had a patience to them that he did not care to describe in any more detail than that, because he had caught himself, after the third time he had looked at it, breathing in time with it. Then he climbed down. Then he asked his wife to look. And then his wife, who had been his wife for 2010 years at the time, looked at him, and looked at the roof, and told him, very quietly, that she had seen it from the ground, and that she had decided, 20 years before, that what was on the roof was between him and the Lord and not her business, and that she would thank him not to ask her to look at it again. Then, the next morning, the print was gone. And the roof rang on the 18th year, and on the 19th, and on every year after, and the preacher held his revival in the brush arbor at the bottom of Tater Holler, under the 3 oaks that the people there called the Brothers, until the year his voice went out. Nan on, the night before he stopped preaching, he told me he had gone up to the roof one more time. Then there was no print that night. Then but there was, on the tin above where his pulpit had stood for 30 2010 9 Augusts, a single rust 2010 marked line, very straight, very patient, very level, as if drawn with a finger. Nan it was the height of a man. Then it ended in a knotted hand. Then he did not go up to the roof again. Then when you ask him, which I only did once, what was on the roof, in the language of the mountains, in the language of the circuit, of the brush arbor, of the meeting, of the long week of August revival under the 3 oaks the locals called the Brothers 2014 Sen Etnet, he will say, very softly, that some things that walk the ridge above a revival are waiting to come down. Then he will say that the Lord, in his mercy, has not opened the door. Nannetinai he will say that he was, for 30 2010 9 years, the door. Ng name. He will not say what was on the other side. Exii, the last sermon at Piney Fork. Piney Fork is a community the road maps do not show. You turn off the state route on a blacktop that used to be a wagon trace. You pass a 1 2010 room post office that no longer has hours. You turn onto a dirt road at a place where there is no sign. You go for what feels like a long time. And then the road opens into a clearing at the head of a creek. And in the clearing there is a clapboard church with a steeple the color of rain. Then the church is called, by the people who still drive out to it on the second Sunday of the month, Piney Fork Baptist. It has 30 2010 members. By the count on the board inside the front door, though 4 of those members have been dead for more than 20 years. The pastor, who has held the pulpit since he was 20 2010 3 and who is now 70 2010 9, holds services in the summer on the porch, because the inside of the church has, since the winter of 2003, not felt right. Nen and I want to tell you what happened on the Sunday in October, this past year, when the pastor preached his last sermon at Piney Fork. Because I was there. I was the only one not from the church who was there. The wife of the man I was staying with had asked me, on the Friday before, if I would come along. Ned and I did not know, when I said yes, what I was agreeing to. Then there were 19 people on the porch that Sunday. 2 of them were children. One of them was the pastor's granddaughter, who had driven down from the city because she understood. In some way her grandfather had not been willing to say aloud to her that this would be the last service. Then the pastor preached from the book of Job. He preached from the 7th chapter. He preached, in the language of these mountains, slowly and at length, about the months of misery and the nights of pain and the thing that rises before the light of the morning, of which Job says, when I say, my bed shall comfort me, my couch shall ease my complaint, then thou scarest me with dreams, and terrifiest me through visions. Nen, he preached for an hour. He did not, that Sunday, raise his voice. And in the middle of the second hymn, when the people of the congregation had risen and were passing a battered leather Bible from one to the other at the front of the porch, a sound came up out of the ground under the church. Dak chenjin jianitz, it was not a knock, and it was not a creak of the floorboards. And it was, by every ear on that porch, the sound a body makes when it is being turned over in a grave of long standing. And want to be clear that I am not describing a thing that I have gone looking for. I am describing a thing that, on a Sunday in October, came up out of the ground under Piney Fork Baptist Church, while 19 people sang a hymn about walking through the valley. Docked, the singing stopped. And then the pastor, who had been standing at the rail of the porch with his Bible in his left hand, set the Bible down. He looked out across the congregation. He did not seem surprised. As mentioned, he had been expecting this. In what he said, in the silence, in a voice that did not break, was this. 1U201C brothers. Sisters, there is a sin of long standing under the floor of this church. There is a wrong that has not been, by any of us, by anyone who has lived in this clearing, made right. The Lord is kind, and he is patient, and he has held his halm. Azalee's granddaughter Delpha, who is still alive, and who lives in the same hollow, told me the story one afternoon in the late summer of 23, in the kitchen of the house that Azalee had lived in, with the kettle on the wood stove and the rain coming up the ridge in long, slow sheets. Delpha said, in the easy, unhurried voice of an old mountain woman telling me about the kind of thing her grandmother had taught her, that the rule had held for the family. She said her children did not whistle at night in the hollow. She said her grandchildren did not whistle at night in the hollow. She said, in her easy, long, unhurried way, that there had been 2 occasions in the years she had been the keeper of the house when someone had whistled against the rule, and that both occasions had, by her own careful observation, answered back. In the first occasion, in the late 70s, one of her older boys had whistled on the upper ridge, hunting late into the autumn dusk. He had whistled at turkey, in the ordinary way of mountain hunters. The woods on the upper ridge had whistled back. The boy had come home in a sweat. He had not, by his own later admission, whistled at the upper ridge since. In the second occasion, in the late 90s, a teenage grandson had been walking the perimeter fence at dusk and had, in the easy teenage way of boys of a certain age, whistled at nothing in particular, in the general direction of the upper laurel. The laurel had answered with a woman's voice. The voice had said, very softly, very directly, 2 words in a language that the boy could not, in any careful listening, place. The boy had not whistled at the upper ridge since. The boy is a man of 47 now, and Delpha told me, in the kitchen of the cabin, that the boy will not, in any circumstances, walk the perimeter fence line at dusk, and that the rule in that family is the rule, and the rule in those hills has held for as long as anyone in the family can remember. And the rule is not a superstition in the family's careful account. The rule is, in the family's careful account, a kind of stewardship. The rule is, in the family's careful account, what you do to keep the woods at the head of Barkley Creek in their own long, patient way, and what you do to keep the woods, by long custom, on your own side of the boundary. V. Tommy Knockers and the mine that sang for more than a century, the coal miners of Appalachia have spoken of a thing that lives in the mines with them. Not a ghost, exactly, not in the way that children use the word, or the way stories around a campfire tend to use the word. A more practical thing, a working presence. The miners call it a Tommy Knocker, and they say it has lived in the deep drifts of the Appalachian coal seams since before the first Anglo miner ever swung a pick in these mountains. The Cherokee, who were here long before any white man, called it something else, They called it the Keeper of the World. They said it had been charged by the old powers with watching the dark places beneath the hills, and that it was not evil so much as it was attentive, the way a foreman is attentive, the way a man who keeps records is attentive. And the miners who came after them, the Scots, Irish, the Welsh, the Germans from the Pennsylvania fields who drifted south, the Italians, the Hungarians, the Poles, took up the same idea almost without thinking about it. They named it something they could say over a beer, but they did not doubt what it was. Tommy knockers are small. That is the first thing the miners say. They are not tall. They are not the size of a man. They are the size of a child, or the size of a kneeling man, or the size of something crouched in the dark at the working face. Their skin, when it can be seen, is dark. Gray, the color of the rock itself, as if they had grown out of the coal. Their eyes are not human eyes. Their feet, when caught in a glimpse of carbide light, do not look like feet. And they knock. 3 knocks. Always 3. The same 3 knocks that echo in the stories of the cabins in the upper hollers. But here, in the mines, the knocks are not the warning of a presence at the door. They are the announcement of a presence in the rock. They are the Tommy knockers telling the miners that they are there. They are watching. They are in the scene. There is an old rule in the mines, passed down as carefully as the rule about whistling in the woods. You do not curse the Tommy knockers. You do not make fun of them, not even among yourselves, not in the deep of a section, not in earshot of the coal. You speak well of them, when you speak at all, because they are, by long experience, the ones who tell you when the roof is bad. They are the ones who knock on the coal where you should not dig. They are the ones who knock on the timber before it is going to give. And the miners who listen and learn from the knocks come home. And the miners who do not listen, do not. There is a particular mine on the West Virginia-Kentucky line, near the head of the Tug Fork, that the old miners of Mingo County will not name on the record. They refer to it as the number 2, or the Far Drift, or just the mine on the other side of the ridge. In the 1940s, when the mine was still in active production, the men who worked the third right section began to report that the Tommy knockers in that part of the mine had stopped being a series of knocks. They had started very gradually to sound like one continuous low sound, rising and falling, almost tonal, almost a song. The miners called it the slow singer. They did not all hear it. The man who heard it most clearly, by the accounts of the foreman, was a third-generation miner named Ezekiel Hatfield, who was not a religious man, who was, by his own later admission, a cusser and a brawler and a drinker of the worst kind of moonshine. He worked the night shift. He had a particular post on the section where he could be alone with the coal for hours at a time, lying on his side in a low seam with a short pick and a carbide lamp, working the face in the dark. He said, at first, that the sound reminded him of his grandmother humming hymns over a washtub. Then he said it reminded him of the wind in the chimney at the old home place. Then he stopped trying to put a melody to it and began to admit, to the men he worked with, that the sound did not remind him of anything he had ever heard. It was its own sound. It was the deep of the mine, sounding back to itself. It went on, by his count, for 7 nights. Then, on the 8th night, the roof of the third right came in. 3 men died under the fall. Ezekiel, who was on a side cut, was not one of them. He had, he said, been moved out of the section by the Tommy knockers 4 hours before the collapse, by a series of low, sharp raps on the wall beside his head, so close that he felt the vibration in his teeth. He had not understood the warning at first. He had thought it was the shift boss, signaling from the haulage. He had climbed the manway to complain. By the time he had climbed back down with the shift boss, the section was already in. And the slow singer had stopped very suddenly, the way a man stops humming in a room where he has just realized that no one else is listening. The mine closed in 56. It has not been reopened. The entrance is in the wooded hillside above an old house place where nobody has lived since the Hatfields moved away in the 70s. The portal is caved in now, but the pour of the collapse is still visible, and the locals, when they drive the road that runs along the ridge, still slow down at the spot, and they still roll up their windows. They say the knocking is still audible even through the caved in entrance on certain nights in early spring when the barometric pressure drops and the deep of the hill remembers. They say the slow singer on those nights can still be heard very faintly underneath the knocks. It is singing to itself in the dark, in the place where the coal has been. And it is waiting for the next company to come and try to take it out again. There is another story told in the same long oral tradition of the Central Appalachian mines that does not specifically concern the Tommy Knockers, and that does not concern any of the named haunting mines of the West Virginia-Kentucky line, and that does, by the long reckoning of the families of the Upper Tug Fork, concerns something else that has lived in the mines since the mines first went into the hills. The story is told in the family of a man named C.C. Justice, who worked in a mine on the upper reaches of the Tug Fork from 1939 until his retirement in 1971. C.C. told the story in a long tape-recorded interview that the Morgantown office of the West Virginia Humanities Council has preserved in 1986 in a voice that did not, by the interviewer's careful observation, waver on the central claim of the story. The central claim of the story is this: in 1947, in the spring, in a deep section of a mine that has since been sealed, a foreman named Luther Hatfield was killed by a slate fall. In a section that had, by the careful testimony of 3 other men who had been in the section with him, been a section that had, for several days before the fall, sounded in the Tommy Knocker way, like a section that was about to fall. The 3 other men who had been in the section with Luther said, in their separate interviews with the union and with each other, that they had heard the knocking. They had heard it 3 times, slowly, in the way that the Tommy Knockers always knock. They had heard it, by their separate careful counts, on 3 nights in succession, from a place on the right rib of the section, at about the height of a man's shoulder. And they had, on the 3rd night, gone to Luther and told him, plainly, that the section was telling them it was no good, and that Luther should, in the careful language of the older miners, stand the men down. Luther had not stood them down. Luther had, in the easy, unhurried voice of a man who had been a foreman for 19 years, told the men that the knocks were the ordinary knocks of working coal, and that he had heard the knocks 1,000 times in his years in the mines, and that there was no need, on the basis of the knocks, to stand the section down. He had told them, in the commonplace words of a working foreman on a working day, to go home and rest and come back the next morning, when the knocks would be forgotten and the section would be, as always, working. The section came in at 4 the next morning, before the night shift had even come off the section. Luther was underneath, in the place where he had been doing the tight work that foremen do on tight days. The 3 other men were above. The slate fell the way slate falls in the deep sections of the Appalachian mines, in a single deep slide, with no warning, with a sound that the men above the section would later describe as the sound of the mountain itself opening its mouth. Luther was killed. The 3 men above survived by, as they put it in their separate interviews, the grace of the knocking that they had heard on the 3 nights before. What C.C. Justice told the interviewer was this: that in the days after Luther's death, the section was reopened by a crew of company men who did not know the story of the knocking. and that the company men who went in to recover the body found Luther's body in a posture that, by long Cherokee tradition and by long mountain tradition, was not the posture of a man who had died in a slate fall. Luther's body was kneeling, facing the right rib of the section, with his hand raised to a place on the rib that corresponded, by careful measurement, to the exact place from which the knocking had been heard by the 3 men on the 3 nights before the fall. C. told the interviewer that one of the company men who went in to recover the body had said, in a voice that did not, by C. C's long memory of the moment, shake, that Luther had, by his posture at the moment of his death, been responding to the knocking. That Luther had, in the long slow minutes of the collapse, gone to the place where the Tommy knockers had been telling him the right rib was about to fall. That Luther had, in the last moments of his life, gone to the place where the warning had been knocked, and that the warning, in the careful way of the older miners, had been correct. C. told the interviewer, in the last minutes of the tape, that he had, in his long career in the mines, never lost a man under his own authority to a slate fall. He attributed this, in the direct, unapologetic language of a man speaking plainly to a tape recorder in his own kitchen, to the knocking. He said that he listened to the knocking, and he stood his men down when the knocking told him to stand his men down, and he had not, in his long career, lost a man. He said, in the same plain voice, that Luther had not listened, and that Luther had been killed, and that Luther had, by his long service in the mines, known better, and that Luther had paid the price of not listening in the long, slow way that the mines charge the men who do not listen. He said, in the last minutes of the tape, that he did not know what the knocking was. He said the knocking had been in the mines as long as he had been in the mines, and that it had been in the mines longer than that, and that it would be in the mines after he was gone. He said, in the easy, practical voice of a man who has spent 32 years under the mountain, that the knocking was a thing that took care of the men who listened to it, and that the men who did not listen to it were, in the long, slow account of the mines themselves, on their own. VI. The brown mountain lights if you drive south on the old 2 lane from Lenoir to Marion. Somewhere around the place where State Road 18 crosses the Catawba, you will see, on your right, a long, low ridge of trees that does not look particularly different from any of the other ridges in Burke County. And if you stop, in the late evening, on a cool autumn night, and look carefully at the dark line of trees on the upper third of that ridge, you may see something that has been reported, by name and in print, since at least the 1820s, and that nobody who lives in these mountains will tell you has ever been satisfactorily explained. The lights are not ball lightning. They are not swamp gas. They are not the headlights of cars coming up from the distant highways, although they are often mistaken for that by people who have not yet learned the trick of distinguishing the genuine lights from the reflected ones. They are not reflections of distant towns, not the refracted glow of distant storms, not the misfiring of any piece of modern equipment. They hover above the dark tree line of Brown Mountain. They drift not in any direction the wind is blowing, but sideways, in patterns that have been recorded on instruments for the better part of a century, and that have never matched any natural pattern the engineers could point to. They appear, and they vanish, and they reappear in another part of the ridge, and they have been doing so by the most careful chronicling of the Cherokee for at least 800 years. The Cherokee legend, which is the oldest legend, is that the lights are the souls of Cherokee women still searching on the ridge above the Catawba for the men who went to a battle that never ended. In some versions, the battle was a real one, a clash between rival bands in the 1600s, in which many men fell on a meadow below Brown Mountain and were buried where they fell. In other versions, the battle was so ancient that the identities of the combatants had been lost, and the women who went looking for their husbands had been searching, generation after generation, for so long that the search itself had become the lights. There is a white legend, much later, that accounts for the same lights by way of a different story. A slave master on a hunting expedition in the early 1800s had lost his way on Brown Mountain in a fog. He had been carrying a lantern. He had died of exposure. His slave had gone up the mountain to look for him and had carried his own lantern. Both had died. The lights, according to this legend, are the two lanterns, still ascending the mountain, still searching, still unable to find one another. But the legends do not explain what the engineers have recorded. They do not explain the fact that the lights occasionally respond to human signals, flashes, shouts, the switching on of searchlights. They do not explain the fact that, in several documented cases in the 1890s and again in the 1920s, the lights have retreated from a viewer who approached them, and that they have moved in unison as if there were more than one, and that the unified motion of the lights has been precise enough to suggest a coordinated will. I have stood on the overlook above Brown Mountain on 3 separate occasions, in different seasons, in different years. On the first occasion, I saw nothing. On the second occasion, late on a cold November night, I saw a single light drift slowly up out of the trees on the left side of the ridge, hover, drift sideways across the ridgeline, hover again, and descend. It was amber. It was the color of a lantern. It was the color of a match struck in a draft. It was the color of nothing I have ever seen in the modern electrical spectrum. It ascended and descended with no visible means. On the third occasion, I saw 2 of them, and the 2 of them moved in tandem. They were not the same color. The larger one was amber, the smaller one was blue, white, and the smaller one, by my best estimate of the distance, was moving in a way that would have required it to pass through the canopy of the trees on the upper slope of Brown Mountain and continue into open air above the ridge. It did not pass through the trees. It was simply there, in the air, where the trees were not, again with no visible means. I will not claim to have an explanation. I am one of those observers who has had the privilege of being fairly close to the phenomenon, on the upper bridge that crosses the gorge below Brown Mountain, and I am one of those observers who can report only what he saw. What I saw, on 2 nights, did not look like swamp gas. It did not look like a reflection of headlights. It looked, in fact, like a presence in the air above the ridge, an organized presence. A presence that had about it the deliberate patience of something that had been doing this for a very long time, and was accustomed to being seen, when it chose to be, by exactly the kind of person who had come up to look. When the locals tell you about the lights, they do not tell you they are frightened. They are not frightened, in the ordinary sense. They will tell you, in the easy conversational tone of a person describing where the good fishing is, that the lights have been there since before the white man came. They will tell you, with the same tone, that you should not call out to them. They will tell you that, if you do, on a still night, you will hear, very faintly, something answer back from the dark of the ridge. They will tell you this, and they will finish the sentence, and then they will be quiet for a little while. And the quietness, when it comes, will be the kind of quietness that settles into a room when a piece of truth has just been said, and the people in the room have decided not to test it. There is a researcher, a man named William Mabin, who spent the better part of 3 decades in the late 19th and early 20th centuries making instrumented observations of the lights on Brown Mountain. Mabin was, in his day, a careful, sober observer with training in engineering and a particular interest in atmospheric phenomena. He was not, by his own extensive writing on the subject, given to speculation. He was given to measurement. His instruments in the years of his observations included a transithiodolite mounted on a permanent base near the upper bridge that crosses the gorge below Brown Mountain. The transit was leveled, calibrated, and oriented, and it was used by Mabin and his small staff in the careful, methodical style of 19th century observational science to triangulate the position of any light observed over Brown Mountain against the ridgeline and against the known terrain features of the gorge. What Mabin found in the years of his observations was that the lights, when they appeared, did not, regardless of the atmospheric conditions of the evening, occupy any consistent position above the terrain. They appeared at varying altitudes. They appeared at varying lateral positions along the ridgeline. They appeared, in several documented instances, at altitudes that would have required them to be, by any terrestrial explanation, in open air above the canopy of the trees on the upper slope. Mabin recorded his observations in a long series of tables and charts. The charts have been preserved by the Burke County Public Library in a small archival box that is not, in any ordinary sense, the kind of material that gets read by anyone outside the small circle of historians of the Brown Mountain phenomena. The charts are, however, in the careful preservation of the library. And the charts are, by the careful examination of anyone who has actually read them, not consistent with any single terrestrial explanation of the lights. Mabin, in the last years of his observational career, wrote a small monograph for the Burke County Historical Society that has been reprinted in the local papers from time to time. And that contains, at its closing page, a paragraph that has been quoted, with varying degrees of accuracy, by nearly every researcher who has visited the ridge since. The paragraph reads, in the Mabin monograph, that the lights are not, by his long careful observation, ball lightning. They are not, by his long careful observation, swamp gas. They are not, by his long careful observation, refracted or reflected or transmitted by any atmospheric condition that he has ever been able to identify. They are not, by his long careful observation, the headlights of cars traveling on any road that is presently in existence in Burke or any of the adjacent counties. They are not, by the evidence of his years of careful triangulation, the headlights of any vehicle that, as far as his instruments could detect, would have been constrained to the topography of the visible terrain. They are, by his long judgment, a phenomenon in the air above the ridge, of a kind that he has been unable, in his long career, to identify to his own satisfaction. The Cherokee elders who were alive during Mabin's career gave him, in several recorded conversations during the years he was visiting the ridge, the Cherokee explanation of the lights. The Cherokee explanation was, in its long, careful way, that the lights were the souls of Cherokee women, that the women were searching, that the searching had been going on for 800 years, and that the searching had not, in any of those centuries, been satisfactorily concluded. The Cherokee elders did not, in those conversations, attempt to account for Mabin's triangulation. They did not attempt to explain why the lights appeared at altitudes inconsistent with the topography of the ridge. They did not attempt to explain why the lights, on several careful occasions, responded to shouts and flares. They simply said, with the patient, and to Mabin, slightly unsettling, assurance of people who have been watching the lights for 800 years, that the lights were the lights, and that the lights were doing what the lights do, and that Mabin's instruments were interesting, and that Mabin's charts were interesting, and that Mabin's careful tables in the long, slow reckoning of the Cherokee were not going to change anything. Mabin took the Cherokee explanation as seriously as he took any other explanation. He noted in his monograph that the Cherokee explanation was not, in any scientific sense, testable. He noted in the same monograph that the Cherokee explanation had been consistent in its careful transmission across many centuries in a way that the other explanations had not. He noted, with the practical caution of a working researcher, that he had been unable, in his long career, to disprove the Cherokee explanation in any respect that would have satisfied a careful investigator. He noted, in the careful final paragraph of the monograph, that the lights were not, in his long and careful judgment, going to be explained by the kind of investigation that his instruments supported, and that the lights were, in his long and careful judgment, going to remain, for as long as the Cherokee had been watching them. The patient, long-continuing concern of a place that had its own reasons for keeping them. V70. The children who saw there is a story people in the southern coalfields tell about a particular stretch of the Russell Fork, near a town the size of a postage stamp, that goes by the name of Hellier. The story is sometimes told as a piece of folklore. Sometimes it is told as a piece of testimony. The thing that makes the story different from most of the others in this book is that the witnesses were children. They were small. They were not given to exaggeration. They were not, by the standards of even a generous observer, given to lying. And there were 5 of them. It began, as so many of these accounts begin, with a knock on the door. The family in question was the family of a coal dispatcher named Lowell Mullins, who lived in 1989 in a small Waite farmhouse about 2 miles outside the unincorporated community of Hellier in Pike County, Kentucky. He had 4 children at home. His wife was expecting a 5th. The family attended the regular services at the regular church. The children were, by Mullins's own later description, ordinary children. They played in the yard. They went to the school down the road. They watched the cartoons in the morning and did their homework in the afternoon. They were afraid of the dark, in the way that all children are afraid of the dark. A low-grade, manageable fear that could be dispelled by a night. Light and a parental voice from the next room. Until one night in October, when the youngest, then 4, came down the stairs into the kitchen and said, very plainly, that a man had come to her bedroom window and knocked. Mullins, half asleep, asked her what man. She described him in the precise, uncomplicated vocabulary of a small child. Tall, no face, a hat that bent down at the front, like the brim of a bird's beak, hands that were dark. He had knocked on the glass 3 times, and then he had stood there, without moving, until she had called for her mother. There was no man at the window when Mullins went up to look. There were no prints on the ground below, although the night had been dry. There was nothing at all. He put the child back to bed and sat up for an hour or so, smoking on the porch, and then he went back to bed himself. He did not, at this point, think there was a problem. He thought it was a dream, until it happened again, 2 nights later. The same window, the same 3 knocks, the same man. This time, the child did not come down the stairs. She screamed. She screamed in a way that Lowell Mullins had never heard any of his children scream, in a way that he later said made his hands shake so badly he could not light a match. He ran up the stairs. The window was closed. The shade was drawn. He pulled the shade back. There was nothing there. There was nothing at the window. There was nothing on the glass. Nothing on the sill. Nothing on the ground below. On the 3rd night, 2 of the children saw it. The youngest, who had been the principal witness, still saw the man. But her older brother, who had come to her room to defend her, saw something different. He saw, he said, what looked like the same shape, only with no eyes. He could see the brim of the hat and the line of the shoulders, and the hands that were pressed flat against the inside of the glass. But where the face should have been, there was a dark place, as if the figure had been carved out of the back of the night itself, as if there had been a man, shaped absence pressed against the window. On the 4th night, all 4 of the children who were then in the house saw it, and Mullins's wife, who had come up the stairs on the older child's scream, saw it too. This time, she described it in language that did not sound like the language of a frightened mother. She described it in language that sounded like she was making an inventory. She counted the features. She counted the height. She counted the way the brim of the hat ended in a point at the front. She counted the 3 knocks, the spacing of the 3 knocks, the rhythm of the 3 knocks. And then she said, very quietly, that she was going to call her own mother, and she did. And her own mother, an elderly woman by the name of Pearlie, came over the next day and stood in the bedroom with the curtains drawn, and she did not, by her own account, see the figure. She smelled something. She described it as a smell like cold iron and wet wool. She said it was the smell of the lower mines, where the air had been stale for a long time. Mullins, who had tolerated the first 3 nights with the low-grade anxiety of a father trying to manage a child's bad dream, did a different thing on the morning after his wife had seen the figure. He borrowed a video camera from a friend at the mine. He set it up on a tripod in the older child's bedroom, with the viewfinder pointing at the window. He turned it on at dusk. He turned it off at dawn. On the second night of filming, the camera, in the small hours of the morning, captured something on the tape. A low, dark shape moving across the glass of the window, very slowly, from one side to the other, casting no reflection, showing no features that could be made out, very deliberately, very patiently, as if it were looking for someone inside the room who had not yet come to the glass. I have seen the tape. It has been shown, by now, on enough cable programs and internet forums that there is little point in pretending it does not exist. The tape shows what it shows. It does not look like a man. It does not look like a coat on a hook. It does not look like the cat. It looks, most recognizably, like a thing that is in the act of trying not to be recognized. The family moved out of the house in 1991. They moved into a double-wide trailer on the other side of the county, and Lowell Mullins said, in a long interview I was able to listen to a decade later, that the phenomenon had not followed them. He was grateful for that. He did not, however, rule out the possibility that it would. His mother's mother, who had been born in the same ridge, had told him, when he was a child, that the things that watch children at windows do not give up. They simply wait, she said, for the children to grow up. And then they begin watching the grandchildren. And if the grandchildren come to the same window, in the same house, in the same holler, on the same ridge, then the knocking starts again. 3 knocks. The same 3 knocks. As if there had been no interruption at all. As if the watching had simply been going on, in the dark, in the cold iron smell and the wet wool smell, in the patient silence of the room, waiting for a familiar face to come to the glass. There was, in the years since the Mullins family left the house on the ridge above the Harlan, a second case that came to the families of the Upper Piney in a different decade, in a different family, and with a different consequence. The case in question did not end with the families leaving. The case in question ended, by the family's long, careful record of itself, with the family's acceptance. The family in this case was a family named Tomlinson. They lived in a small house in the lower part of Piney Creek, in a stretch of the watershed that was, by the long reputation of the old families of the watershed, a stretch that had been, for as long as anyone in Piney could remember, watched the Tomlinson children, who were 4 in number, ranged in age, in the year of the events, from 7 to 14. The mother and father of the children had grown up on the same watershed. They had, by their own account, never, in their years of growing up on Piney, heard any of the stories that the older families told about the place at the lower end of Piney, because the older families, in their way, did not tell those stories to young couples who were moving back into the watershed. The older families let the young couples find out on their own. The Tomlinsons found out on a Saturday night in October of 2002. They had put the children to bed. They had eaten dinner. The father of the family, a man named Kevin, had gone out to the kitchen to wash the dishes. The mother of the family, a woman named Callie, had gone up the stairs to check on the youngest, who had been unwell. The stairs were on the side of the house. The upstairs had 2 bedrooms, with a narrow hallway between them. Callie had reached the top of the stairs. The lights in the upstairs hallway were off. The door of the oldest child's room was open. The door of the middle child's room was open. The door of the youngest's room was partly open. The youngest child, who was 7, had been asleep. The 7-year-old child, who had been unwell, was sitting up in her bed with her arms around her knees, looking at the door of her own room. Callie asked her what was wrong. The child said, in the careful, direct voice of a child who has not yet learned, by careful socialization, that some things should not be said, that there was a man at the end of the bed. The man, the child said, was not her father. The man was not her mother. The man, the child said, was not in the room with her. The man, the child said, was at the end of the bed, looking down at her, from a distance that was, by the child's careful later description, perhaps a foot or 2. The man had been in the room, the child said, for what the child estimated as 5 or 10 minutes, looking down at her, with the long, patient attentiveness of a man looking at a child. Callie went into the bedroom. She turned on the light. The man, of course, was not there. Callie asked the child, in the quiet voice of a mother who has heard enough stories to take the question carefully, what the man had been doing. The child said, again in the patient, direct voice of a small child speaking plainly, that the man had not been doing anything. The man had, by the child's careful observation, been watching her. The child said, on the same plain, direct occasion, that the man had been watching her the way that people watch a fire at the end of a long day, with a kind of long, slow, absorbed attentiveness, with a kind of long, slow, not quite anything, with a kind of long, slow watching that goes all the way through. The Tomlinson family did not, in the weeks and months that followed, leave the house at the lower end of Piney. They did the opposite. They talked very carefully to the older families of the watershed. They asked questions, in the easy, respectful voice of young mountain parents asking about the long history of a place they were about to raise their children in. The older families, in the easy, long and hurried way of the older families of Piney, told them what the lower part of Piney is, and what the lower part of Piney has always been, and what the lower part of Piney, by long custom, has been watched for. They told the Tomlinsons that the lower part of Piney is, in the long oral tradition of the watershed, a place that has been watched, in a patient long way, for as long as the families of the watershed have been in the watershed. They told them that the watching is not, in any ordinary sense, hostile. They told them that the watching is, in their long experience of the watershed, gentle. In the long, slow way that a mother's attention is gentle, and that the attention, in their long experience, has a particular interest in the small children of the families that have lived in the lower part of Piney. They told them that the watching of the children is not, in their long experience, an unfriendly watching, and that the watching is, in their long judgment, what the lower part of Piney does for the people who have been in its care. The Tomlinsons accepted the explanation. They did not, in the years since, attempt to chase the watching out of the lower part of Piney. They did not, in the years since, attempt to seal the windows of the small house at the lower end of the creek. They did not, in the years since, attempt to keep their children out of the rooms in which the watching had been observed. They let the children be the children. They let the children sleep in the same rooms in which the watching had been. They let the children grow up in the ordinary way of children who have grown up on Piney Creek in the long history of the families of the watershed. And the watching continued. In the long, quiet way of the lower part of Piney, and the children grew up, and the children are now adults, and the adults, by their own quiet testimony, do not, in any ordinary way, mind that the watching continued, and that the watching is, by careful observation, still in the rooms at the lower end of the creek, and that the watching is, in the long-running experience of the Tomlinson family, the long, patient way the lower part of Piney has of keeping the families it has always kept. Vate, the Bell Witch of Adams, Tennessee, of all the stories in these mountains, none is more quoted, and none is more genuinely strange than the story of what happened to the Bell family on their farm in Adams, Tennessee, in the years between 1817 and 1820. 1. It is often called the most thoroughly documented haunting in American history. It is also often called a hoax. Both descriptions are accurate, in their way. The truth, as so often in these hollers, lies somewhere between. And what lies between is not a place that the daylight mind likes to stay in very long. John Bell was an established farmer. He was a member of the Methodist Church. He had married a respectable local woman named Lucy, and together they had raised, in the ordinary way of the time, a family of children on a substantial farm on the south side of the Red River, just north of what is now Adams. The farm was good. The Bell family was comfortable. They had slaves in the ordinary way of that country and that time. They had standing in the community. They were, by all accounts, unremarkable people. The kind of people who would not, in the natural course of hill country history, have become the focus of any legend at all. It began, by every contemporary account that survives, with a knocking on the outside wall of the house. 3 knocks, as if someone were standing at the clapboards, very near the kitchen, and very politely requesting that the door be opened. Not, at first, anything more terrifying than that. Ordinary knocking, of a kind that could have been explained by the children of the neighbors playing a prank. Then the knocking moved inside the house. It moved, within 3 nights, to the bedsteads of the children. It moved to the harness hanging on the wall by the front door. It moved to the furniture in the parlor. It moved with a deliberateness that an ordinary haunting does not have. By the time the winter of 1817 had set in, the Bells' home had become a place in which every object in the house could, at any moment, produce a sound. Chains rattling, chairs scraping, beds creaking. And always, that first 3 knocks, as if the source of all of it were a single presence that had introduced itself to the family at the front door, and that was now making itself at home. And then it began to speak. What spoke was a voice, a woman's voice, by the descriptions of the children and by the visitors who began to come to the farm, curious or skeptical, throughout the following months. It came from the walls. It came from the empty corners of the room. It came from places in the house where there was no one standing. It spoke to John Bell by name. It called the children by name. It answered questions put to it by neighbors who had come to see whether the stories were true. And it was articulate, in a way that none of the witnesses had ever before encountered in any disembodied voice. It was witty. It was angry. It was, at moments, obscene. It was, at other moments, appallingly well-informed. It told Bell things he had told no one. It told neighbors things about their own affairs that they had not shared with the Bell family. It quoted scripture. It quoted local gossip. It did everything a person could do, short of presenting itself in the flesh. The entity, when it was asked, claimed to be the spirit of a woman named Kate Batts, who had lived in the neighborhood, and who had quarreled with John Bell over a piece of land in the years before her death. There is no firm historical corroboration of any such woman. There are county records that suggest there was a woman of that name in the neighborhood, but the records are the ordinary thin records of a thinly settled frontier county, and they do not say enough to confirm or to deny. The entity, however, was immovable on the topic. It was Kate Batts. It had come back. It had come back because of the land, and it was going to stay. Andrew Jackson, who was at that time a United States Senator from Tennessee, and who would go on to be a President of the United States, was passing through Adams in the summer of 1819, and he stopped with a delegation of his retinue at the Bell Farm. He did not, by most accounts, believe in ghosts. He was a man of the Enlightenment, a man of the law, a man who would spend his career in the empirical world of American politics. But the thing spoke to him. It knew him by name. It called him a liar. It called him a coward. It spoke to him about his own affairs, his own ambitions, his own private concerns, in a tone so intimate, so precise, and so observant that Jackson is said to have left the house shaken, with a famous remark attributed to him, more or less that he would rather face the whole British Army than that spirit again. The remark has been disputed, and it is very likely that the story was polished over the years. But the cold fact is that Andrew Jackson visited the Bell Farm. And the cold fact is that he left it changed. What happened to John Bell, in the end, is the part of the story that no one in Adams likes to discuss. Bell became ill in the winter of 1820. His health declined, week by week, in a manner that physicians of the time could not diagnose. The entity throughout this period told the family, plainly, that Bell was going to die. The entity told them when. The entity told them how. And in December of 1820, John Bell was found dead in his bed. Small vials of an unknown substance were found in the house. The entity, when asked, said that it had given him the vials, and that he had taken them of his own accord. The activity continued after his death. It continued after his burial. It turned, in time, on the children. It made a particular attachment to one of the daughters, Betsy, and it followed her, eventually, to the cabin of her new husband, and it settled there for a period of years, until Betsy herself, in her middle age, died of what one local account described as exhaustion. The Bell Witch story, retold for 2 centuries in those hills, has become a piece of American folklore so prominent that the cave on the Bell Farm is now a tourist destination. A roadside attraction, a place where the curious can park and eat lemonade in the parking lot, and take a guided walk down into a small opening in the rock where the entity, by local tradition, kept its bottles. The cave is small, it is ordinary, and the presence in it, if there is a presence in it, is the kind of presence that does not advertise itself. But the fear of the story, for me, is not the entity itself. It is the duration. It is the 4 years of the haunting, year after year, night after night, with the same voice in the walls, the same 3 knocks on the furniture, the same intimate knowledge of the family's affairs. It is that this thing did not pass through. It settled. It made itself a tenant. It was there, in the house, for years. And the house, in that kind of presence, stops being a house. It becomes a territory. And the people who live in it become, in some sense that I cannot fully articulate, the incumbents of a space that has another master. And the master has a voice. And the voice knows your name. And it has by now learned when you are afraid. There is an episode in the Bell Witch story that is not often told in the tourist-facing storytelling of the modern Bell Witch Cave, and that is by the careful analysis of the Adams families who have kept the record, perhaps the strangest of the long, strange episodes of the haunting. It concerns the entity after John Bell's burial, and it concerns a series of visits that the entity, by the careful long-term record, paid to John Bell's surviving family members over the course of the following winter. The first visit, by the Adams family record, occurred on a Tuesday in late December of 1820. The surviving members of the family had, by that point in the long haunting, simply tried to continue their ordinary lives with a kind of grim diligence that, in the long history of the Bell farm, had become the rule. The surviving members had drawn the curtains. They had closed the shutters of the front parlor on the nights when the voice was loud. They had, in the easy, ordinary way of farm families who were working through a long, terrible winter, continued the work of the farm, the work of the kitchen, the work of the well, and the work of the long, slow rotation of the household, in a kind of constant attendance to the small, ordinary business of living. On the Tuesday in late December, the eldest of the surviving daughters, a young woman of 19, was in the small bedroom at the back of the house, changing the bed linens of a younger sister who had been unwell. The work was ordinary. The room was quiet. The light, in the slow, ordinary way of the early winter evenings, was fading in the small panes of the window. The young woman had been working for perhaps half an hour when she became aware, with the steady, unforced attentiveness of a person who has lived in a haunted house for 5 years, and who has, by long familiarity with the haunting, become a reliable witness of its small, strange recurrences, that the entity was in the room with her. The entity, by her later record, did not speak. The entity did not knock. The entity did not produce any of the small, audible signs that had been its ordinary way of announcing its presence in the long, strange years of the haunting. The entity was, by her careful later account, simply there. It stood, by her observation, near the corner of the small bedroom in the kind of careful, not-quit-doing anything that the entity had, in the long, strange year, taken to as a kind of explicit signature. It watched her. It watched her the way the mimic voice in another hollow, another century later, would watch the families of the Upper Tellico. It watched her with a kind of long attention that was not, in any ordinary careful observation, hostile. It was, she said, in the careful, deliberate voice of a young woman who would, in later years, become the long-standing matriarch of the surviving Bell family in the Adams community, attentive in the way that a person is attentive at the bedside of someone they have been asked to take care of. She did not, by her later careful account, speak to the entity on that Tuesday evening. She did not, on that Tuesday evening, attempt to leave the small bedroom. She finished the small, ordinary task of changing the bed linens. She smoothed the sheets. She walked out of the room. The entity was, by her observation as she left, in the same position at the corner of the room, watching the small, ordinary task with the same long, unforced attention. She closed the door behind her. She went downstairs. She spoke to her mother. They did not, that evening, attempt to enter the small bedroom, and the entity, by the careful Adams family record, came back the next night, and the next, and the next.